Hello, and I hope this message finds you well. Maybe a month ago at this point, I finished reading the Book of the Hopi, and this is a collection of Hopi origin myths and tales, really similar to the Bible, except, for the Hopi people. And it also contains the history of this people. And it's that section of the book that I want to talk about. So while reading the book, when I got to the history section, I was interested to find that it begins with contact with Europeans. And it really describes the history of the Hopi people losing their land and their culture and spirituality through erasure and oppression at the hands of the Europeans, first the Spaniards and then the white colonists. And as I was reading this, I was like, well, why does the history begin there? What happened to the Hopi prior to their contact with white culture, and wasn't that a history in itself? And on this note, two things. One, there are earlier events, recorded events for the Hopi people, but they're recounted in the mythic section. There are events that have to do with the creation of our world and also the destruction of our world, the cyclic destruction of our world, and the Hopi people's survival through each of those upheavals. This is very interesting in terms of geologic history as well, because there are descriptions through these phases that match what we think of as Pangaea, or the myth of the flood, which exists in the Judeo-Christian tradition as well. And then secondarily, there also was a history preceding contact with Europeans, in that there was intertribal conflict among the Hopis. There were different sects of Hopis, and they would combat one another over land. And then they also had conflict with other tribes like the Navajo. But nevertheless, within the structure of this book, the history section begins with contact with Europeans. And so at first I was like, sort of from a social justice perspective, I was like, I feel this is not giving enough credit to the Hopis, that their history is really a history of conquest by other people. But then I zoomed out more broadly, and I was like, isn't that what history is? When we study history in school, it's almost exclusively a story of groups stealing resources from one another or subjugating one another. It's almost universally a quest for power. And so this phrase came to me, which is the phrase around which I want to structure this short talk, which is history describes a lostness. In other words, history describes what happens when humanity forgets its sacred purpose. And in that state, we are ruled by ego, which is a form of insanity, without realizing it. And so we do feel this need to capture land, which comes from scarcity or fear, and subjugate other people and exploit them, which comes from a forgetting their humanity. And again, this kind of scarcity mindset of I need to enlist other people to do my bidding because I don't have enough strength on my own. And it's really, in its extreme, a kind of megalomania, where we want to make ourselves larger and larger and more powerful, because at root we feel deeply insecure and unsafe. And by contrast, in the first 2/3 of this book of the Hopi, I think we see what humanity's actual purpose is, which is to worship God and the bounty we have been given. In the case of the Hopi, although different cultures had different methods, through practices of renewal with respect to the land. So things like rain dances, or they have other practices that usher in corn or harvests. They have practices surrounding birth and death. These sorts of things, I believe, are really what humanity is meant to do with our time on Earth. we're meant to know and remember that the plenitude we have been given is so much larger, so much more magnificent than anything we could erect, that really our goal and our practice here is just to reify and enjoy it, right? And I mean both aspects of that quite seriously. We're meant to recognize with humility our smallness before these things, and we're also meant to relish in them and thank God through our enjoyment for what we have been given. And in that mode of being, there really is no history. There's nothing to do, there's nothing to conquer, there's nothing to develop, there's no linearity of time, because we're more in the seasonality of life, the ephemerality of one thing sliding into the next, and we're in appreciation and celebration of those dynamics. So in closing, I'll just offer something else in the book that I found quite profound, which is that the Hopi believe that they were led to the desert. So I live in New Mexico, and really this region of the country, they were led to the Southwest precisely because it's a desert, precisely because there's little rain. And through that fact, the Hopi believed that they would always need to remember to pray for rain and thus be in connection to their God. Whereas if they lived in a place of greater natural yield, where the earth was just more forthcoming, they might take it for granted and thus lose their connection over time. And so I think this sort of aphorism of the desert in its own way inculcating spirituality reminds us of the orientation human beings are meant to maintain, and that keeps us sane, I would argue. It keeps us sane to have practices by which we remember our smallness and both give thanks and pray for that which is greater than us. So history describes a lostness, and the contrast is this permanent presence of worship and gratitude. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a blessed day. Goodbye.